Well, welcome in for another great episode of the True Man podcast. On today's show, we, of course, like I try to do, every show, are making True Man history. We're going to do an interview from the airport today, which is amazing, I think. So, welcome to the show, Mr. Frank King. Frank was a writer for the Tonight Show for 20 years, which is why he's making faces at me right now.
Yeah.
He's a TED Talk speaker as well as a TED Talk coach. Of course, a comedian, because you would have to be in order to write for the Tonight. Well, I guess that's not necessarily true.
No.
That's probably a side note. But one of the big reasons Frank's on the show today really is to bring awareness and to talk to us more about suicide prevention. So, Frank, welcome to the True Man podcast on your traveling adventure here.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm in the world's worst airport. Well, not the world's worst. There are worse ones in the world. I've been to most of them. I'm in the United States' worst airport, Kansas City. They should burn this thing to the ground. I probably shouldn't say that loudly.
Yeah.
They'll drag me out.
But that is a very old airport that you're at. So it's actually been several years since I've been there, but
Wilbur Wright is the TSA guy.
Is he?
Yeah.
You should have got his autograph.
I should have.
Well, you can see how this podcast is going to go. I think we're going to have some serious conversation, but we're probably going to have some serious laughs too. So, I mentioned Frank's and it seems kind of weird to say this, an expert on suicide prevention, but I think as this rolls out, you'll understand why I'm using that. Why I'm using that phrase. But Fred, Frank, I think it's important. I don't even know who the heck I'm talking to. Frank, I'm rattled. I'm completely rattled. Yeah. I think it's important to shed light on the idea of mental health and suicide because, the last couple of years of isolation, wearing mask, like you're doing now because you're at the airport. We don't want you to get dragged off to jail in the middle of the interview. But, basically this brings to light a big problem that's going on in our culture. Suicide, men, suicide, just people in general. But since this is a podcast on men, we'll focus in on men. But this pandemic has not helped this situation in the least, right? It's escalated it big time. So
actually, no.
The
overall suicide rate during the pandemic went down 1.5 points. The only group that saw an increase were youth and college students. And I think the reason may have been that somewhere between 800 and 1 million extra calls to the suicide prevention lifeline happened.
Oh, there
People
you go.
Actually reaching out for the first time. So small silver lining.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that because I think that suicide. I've listened to a few of your talks. Suicide prevention hotline is a big factor in this. Having somebody to talk to go to is a big factor in this. But give us a little background on yourself and how you personally, become an expert in suicide.
Well, and people say, you're a suicide expert. I go, no, if I was a suicide expert, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It's like in my first TED Talk, before I did it, I went to the TED.com site to research how other people handle the topic. And I thought there'd be dozens and dozens and dozens of talks on suicide. There were 3. So I said to the audience, well, duh, if you're really good at suicide, you're not going to be recording a TEDx talk.
Right.
So I actually failed at it, fortunately. A friend of mine came up to me, I don't know, some point, he goes, hey, man, how come you didn't pull the trigger? I go, hey, man, could you try to sound slightly less disappointed? The problem for men is really 8 out of 10 suicides in the U.S. right now are men, age 45, 54. And part of the problem is, big boys don't cry. Guys don't tend to reach out. They don't ask for help. And it's not just mental things. Guys wait too long to, if they have a lump in their testicle, they don't go in to get the PSA for their prostate or colonoscopy, and they end up dying to things that are easily treat it if you catch them early. But again, it's that mental attitude of, I'm tough. Hang on one second. I can't. How do I? Come on. Sorry about that phone call in the middle of the. So, and I grew up in the South, and I understand the whole big boys don't cry thing.
Yeah.
I did a talk. Actually, did 7 keynotes in New York City in late January at a construction site. 1,000 guys. We divided them into 7 groups. Construction has the highest rate of suicide of any occupation. Part of the problem is it's heavily males. And get this, 1,000 people a year die in construction accidents.
Yeah.
Guess how many die by suicide? Over 5,000 a year die by suicide. You're 5
in
times more likely.
In that industry.
Yep, you're 5 times more likely to die by suicide as a construction worker than you are an accident. I mean, it's ridiculous. That's why my co-authors and I put a 4-book series together. 3 books are on Amazon, and one's coming out this April on men's mental health. Because one of my co-authors, she works with first responders on suicide prevention. She wanted to buy a book for one of the guys on men's mental health, and there were none. She called a publisher friend of hers and said, "Why not?" He goes, "Because they don't sell." So we decided that was a bit of a vacuum. So we would fill it with these 4 books. It's sort of a chicken soup for the soul style. 12 guys, each one has a problem, and each one tells you how they're coping. Because that's what guys told us they wanted: real guys, real problems, and how they're really coping, so they can put those things, not just theoretical or academic, but actual guys with problems and what they're doing. So that's a big slice of the problem. Here's the good news, Mike. 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal, men and women and non-binaries, are ambivalent. 8 out of 10 are ambivalent. 9 out of 10 give hints in the last 7 days leading up to an attempt, which means most people want to be saved. We can save the vast majority of the people. The catch is, how do you know somebody's depressed and having thoughts of suicide? And that's what I teach when I speak. Signs and symptoms of depression, thoughts of suicide, what to do, what to say.
I'm interested in what the tips are. By the way, I just bought the first 3 books, so you've sold at least one of each. So I just wanted to let you know that.
You're the guy.
Yeah, I know. There's only one person listening to the podcast too, so it's okay. It works out.
Hey, man. Actually, we are selling more to women than to men, and we figure it's because they've got a man in their life they cannot figure out, and it is truly a manual. It's called a mental mechanics manual. A lot of car metaphors. If a guy treated his car like he treats his brain, he better buy a bus pass, because there's routine maintenance. You have to anyway.
Yeah.
So that's why we wrote the book series, because with men, it's such a big problem for men. Now, women attempt 3 times more often, but men tend to complete because they use a firearm. I was going to use a firearm, a nickel-plated Ruger 38, loaded with Federal Hydroshock hollow points. There's no coming back from that.
Yeah,
that's pretty much the end. So we're hoping that we can bring the rate of suicide among men down. Part of the problem, Mike, is got a lot of guys went to high school, came out, got a good blue collar job, maybe in manufacturing, worked their way up to shop steward. A lot of people think all the jobs went overseas. About 15-20% of the jobs manufacturing jobs went overseas. The other 80-85% were taken over by AI and robotics. So you're a shop steward making good middle class wages one day, and then because of AI and robotics, or maybe the business went overseas, you're not doing that anymore. And guys tend to tie their identity to their job.
Yeah.
So if I'm not that guy, who the heck am I? And that begins that downward spiral. And then, substance abuse disorder and self-medication. And so anyway, yeah, that's why we undertook the project, is because men are an endangered species practically.
Well, I commonly refer to it as just kind of hiding those unanswered questions, just sticking them deep down in your soul, hoping you never have to deal with it. And and I think that's what we do. And we're not very good at looking at the mirror to really address those. In fact, things really have to go pretty sideways before that happens. But
and that's what happens with men. I have the guy who wrote the forward for the first book. He only treats suicidal men, and most are referrals from psychologists and psychiatrists who are terrified that the guy's going to kill himself and the family's going to sue. So they dump him on this fella. But he enjoys working with him. He said most men don't come to see a therapist voluntarily. They don't wake up one morning and go, I really need to see a therapist.
Yeah.
Usually you have to push them into a corner. You have to say, if you're the wife, look, I'm not going to put me and the kids through this. I love you. But if you don't get into therapy, we're gone. Or the boss says, look, if you don't go and grab a copy of the EAP and talk to HR about the benefits we have for mental health, don't bother coming in on Monday. He said, though, once a guy buys in, he's all in and he's willing to help other guys. That's why
Yeah.
we ended up with 64 authors when we didn't think we'd get that many men to come clean about some problem. And they came out of the woodwork because they believe in paying it forward. Somebody helped them and they want to help other guys.
I think if guys know where they can go, where they can have this, I've seen this in men's small group, where they know there's a safe environment. And sometimes that's about building trust, but where they know there's a safe environment and they can be around a group of other guys, they're willing to have that conversation.
Well, you know what helps is, and they started something in Australia called the Shed Project. Shed in Australia is our equivalent of a garage attached to the end of your house.
Right.
They found if you put two guys working on a car, both under the hood of the car, and neither one looking in each other's eyes, they'll talk about anything, important things. Or fishing. I got a friend who goes fishing with his dad. And they're in opposite ends of the bass boat, facing opposite directions, fishing. And he goes, we talk about anything as long as we're not looking each other in the eye. The veterans for foreign wars, they all have a bar and they almost always have a dart board or dart boards and dart tournaments and dart teams. But they discovered if you got guys looking down the lane at the dart board and not looking at each other, and they can talk about important things. So you're right. If you put them in the right environment and provide them, with a safe space where they don't have to look each other in the eye, like across the table at Starbucks, which women I don't think have any problem doing.
Right.
Generally, but men do, but for whatever reason, distracted. If they're doing something else, they have no trouble talking about. The barbershop movement. Barbershop has been a safe place for African Americans for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've been training barbers in mental health first aid. Because again, you're facing away from the barber. Barber's behind you. You can talk about anything.
Golf is the same thing for me.
Yeah.
Although usually I get home, my wife says, what'd you guys talk about? And we're like, well, I was looking for my ball in the woods. I really don't recall. Yeah. So what are some things that people can look for with suicide? I mean, people that may have that tendency. I mean, are there things that we can look for to really reach out and help somebody and have that conversation?
Yeah, well, let's go upstream a little bit.
Okay.
Depression is the number one cause for suicide. So how do you know somebody's depressed? Well, they have trouble getting up in the morning, maybe late to work a lot, but they rally in the afternoon. They let their personal hygiene go. Usually they're well put together.
Mm-hmm.
But, their hair's kind of dirty, clothes are not so clean, and maybe because they're having trouble dragging themselves out of bed to run a little wash, take a shower. Either they're eating too much or they can't eat. They're sleeping too much or they can't sleep. Those are probably the top three symptoms or signs. The question comes up, what do you say to somebody you believe is depressed? Well, here's what you don't say. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Turn that frown upside down. My favorite is snap out of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Man up.
Would you ever go up to somebody with diabetes? Diabetes? So you got to snap out of that. Because mental illness is a chronic illness.
Yeah.
What do you say? You say, look, I'm here for you and I mean it. I know you're not crazy or lazy or self-absorbed. I know that depression is a mental illness. Here's the deal. With time and treatment, things will get better. I'll take the time. I'll help you get the treatment. Now, here's the tough one. You have to ask them in no uncertain terms, are you having thoughts of suicide? And if you can't ask that question, you find somebody who can. Give them my phone number. I'll ask them. It's a difficult question, but you need to know. Now, let's say they're not forthcoming, but your gut still tells you and I always say go with your intuition, that they may be having thought. How would you know? Well, they talk about death and dying. You catch them Googling death and dying. Death and dying appears as a theme in their artwork or their music or their writing. They're getting their personal affairs in order, especially if they're giving away prized possessions, because they want to make sure the possessions go to the people they want them to go to when they're gone. And if you give away a pet, they're making sure the animal is going to be, that's very dangerous. Here's a counterintuitive one. They've been depressed forever. Now they're happy for no reason. You can tell. And you're happy because they're happy. But the problem is they may be happy because they've chosen time, place, and method, and they know the pain is coming to an end. That's what suicide is most often about. It's not about wanting to kill yourself. It's about simply wanting to end that pain. I didn't want to kill myself. I just wanted to end the pain. Now, let's say they are forthcoming. They go, yes, I'm suicidal, having thoughts of suicide. What do? You say, do you have a plan? And if they say yes, you say, what is the plan? And if it's detail, time, place, and method, you need to get them on the phone with the Suicide Prevention Lifeline or texting to the text line, which is 741-741. If they have, and people always ask me, when do you call the cops? Well, if they're a danger to themselves immediately or somebody else, you got to call the police. Now, that's going to buy them a 3-day, all expenses paid vacation and a nice gated, But let's say they are suicidal, but they don't have a plan. What do you say? Well, I would say, well, are you going to kill yourself? And if they say no, I say, well, tell me why not. Make them give voice to whatever's keeping them here, because something is keeping you here. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. And that in the mental health business, they call that a turning point. If you get them to voice whatever's keeping them here, then you say, look, would you mind if I work with you to make a plan to keep you safe just for today? After you figure out what the turning point, the turning point, when you realize why they're still here. So that's basically the protocol.
It's interesting. I mean, honestly, you're telling me that it seems very common sense. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, if I was in that situation with somebody, are those the things I would say? Am I educated enough, of course I'm educated enough, but I mean, how can people educate themselves in order to put themselves in the right position to say those things?
Well, there's a great organization called mentalhealthfirstaid.org. mentalhealthfirstaid.org. They have an 8-hour class, and it's usually anywhere from $5 to $25. And it's just a 101, mental health 101. With starts with depression and schizoaffective disorder and bipolar. It goes into non-lethal self-harm and thoughts of suicide. But again, it's all signs, symptoms, and then how do you find resources? What do you say? What don't you say? So mentalhealthfirstaid.org is a great place to start.
So I want to circle back to something here. We talked a little bit about basically middle-aged white guys are the what's the right way to turn? I mean, that's the sweet spot for people killing themselves. Why is that age area? What's happening? Do they know why people are taking their lives at that age? I could take a guess, but I thought I'd throw it out to you.
I think it's a lot of displacement, job displacement. Where, like I said, they've lost their job, and men tend to identify their identities tied to their job. It's like an athlete. If you were a Pop Warner star, as a little kid in football, and you've been a football star all your life, and you make it to college or maybe the NFL, and you blow out something, and to wake up the next morning, you're no longer a football star. Well, then who the hell are you? And that's apparently really difficult for men to adjust to that new reality.
Well, I often say there's two things that you're going to get no matter what, right? You meet somebody for the first time. What's your name? And what do you do?
What do you do?
And those are really two identifying factors that can, I would dare say, be crippling. I mean, I went through a period of time where somebody would ask me what I did, and I would curl up like a little ball because I didn't really want to, I didn't want to address the situation, and there was no intent behind it. It's just, it's kind of that natural follow-up question to what's your name, because that's how people identify you, you know? And for somebody who, now I didn't have suicidal thoughts. I was upset. I wouldn't call myself even depressed, but I mean, for somebody who's depressed or having suicidal thoughts, I can see where that may really.
Yeah. Because how do you describe yourself? Even my lovely wife, who graduated high school and went to business college, but didn't go to a college, a recognized 4 year occasionally, because a lot of the people we, know went to college somewhere.
Yeah.
So that was a very, very uncomfortable question for her. Where'd you go to college? It was a 2 year business college and nobody ever heard of. So it was uncomfortable. Fortunately, nobody's asked recently, but when you're at an age, when everybody's just gotten out of college and they're getting, married and whatever,
Yeah.
then so
I was watching one of your talks and you bring up something I think is incredibly interesting. So if I get this wrong, I'm you feel free to correct me, but you were talking about mental ableness versus disabledness. Did I get that right?
yeah, that's a whole TED talk I've got.
Yeah, that I found that to be fascinating because I think so much of the time we just take mental health and we almost brush it aside as a negative. And to a large degree, you're describing it as well, maybe it's an advantage.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that. I thought that was an interesting perspective.
Yeah, Malcolm Gladwell in his book David and Goliath talks about dyslexia specifically and how it's a desirable disadvantage, because if you have dyslexia, you never wish it on anybody. But if you have dyslexia and you're able to adjust and do workarounds, then you generally end up being a very successful, oftentimes entrepreneur. However, the other 50% of the people who don't adjust and do workarounds, they end up in jail. But he believes that if handled properly, it's a desirable disadvantage. I believe that my depression and thoughts of suicide are simply the flip side of my comedic ability, imagination, and creativity. Because there's no other way I can explain the way my mind works. It just, when I used to hit back at hecklers, people would say to me, "How'd you think that up?" I go, "I didn't think it up. When you heard it, I heard it."
Yeah,
I didn't think.
And I'm trying to be terribly careful on this podcast so I don't heckle you and get a zinger thrown at me.
Yeah. Oh man, I'll nail you. Well, the other night, last week, I was at a speakers conference. They had us all get up and speak, and I talked about, my grandmother died by suicide, my great aunt, it runs in my family. I came close enough, to killing myself. I can tell you what the barrel of my gun tastes like. I think about it all the time because of my chronic suicidal ideation. And so they gathered all the speakers together. It was a competition. Everybody did 5 minutes. They gathered all the speakers together, and many of them very new speakers. So they were terrified. Got them all together, and I know what he was after. He said, "Look, it wasn't as bad as you thought, was it? I mean, you did well." He goes, "Nobody died." And I piped up, thought about it. Where'd that come from? I have no idea. But the same brain, same wiring. I mean, that's that lightning fast, and yeah, I really do believe. And the whole idea behind the TED Talk was, if we could convince a child,
Yeah,
you have a mental disability, but here's something, you may also have a mental ability or two that your peers can't touch.
sure.
And pretty much everybody I've met who has a child with an issue, they are, well, are they really smart? Are they talented? Oh, you wouldn't believe. They rattle off whatever they're talented in. So I believe if we could treat the disability and wrap our arms around and encourage the ability, it would change the frame for the kid, for their peers, maybe reduce bullying, stigma, and eventually suicide.
It seems like it could potentially change the framework, period. I mean, because I heard you talking about that and I'm like, well, geez, man, that. And I started thinking about probably some of the things I've said in my life, with people that I've, had some mental health issues. And just because somebody doesn't mean their life has to be over. There's something that they're good at, and we're not focusing in on that. And
there are 30 Fortune 500 companies. I saw this episode on 60 Minutes 2 years after I did my TED Talk on it. On 60 Minutes, there are 30 Fortune 500 companies who are hiring people on the spectrum simply for the one thing they do extremely
There
well
you
and
go.
paying them hands. I mean, these people are moving out of their parents' basement for the first time ever. And usually some monotonous, something that you'd have to have a machine to do otherwise because another human would just go nuts doing it. But for whatever reason, they're good at it. They're comfortable with it. It's just their thing. So it's slowly but surely changing.
Apparently, we need to find more of those people because there's far too many people leaving the workplace. You can't get timely food at a restaurant anymore. But
Yeah,
anyway,
the great resignation. I've got a client talking about that in TEDx, and we believe that people, during the pandemic, kind of took a pause. Do I really want to be in food service? No. The problem is, I don't think a lot of them made that second step. Well, what do I want to do? Because as long as the unemployment was coming, you didn't have to make that call. But last September 5th, when the unemployment stopped, you need a plan B. You should have thought of this a little sooner. We know you don't want to be in food service. You need to figure out what you do want to do. So,
yeah. Well, I agree with you. I don't think that they have a plan B, but however long plan A drags on,
no.
that that's a whole other interesting um, discussion. And I meant to do this early on because you really have some incredible statistics as related to just the amount of people that have attempted, tried, unfortunately succeeded at suicide. Could you share some of those numbers? Because they're staggering, the statistics and some of the numbers.
Yeah, every year in the United States, roughly 8 million people seriously consider it, 1.4 million attempt. And I think in the last year, 47,000 people died by suicide. That's one every 9 minutes. Think about this. That's a fully loaded 737 going to ground like a lawn dart every day.
Yeah.
Everybody dies, and nobody's talking about it. I mean, in the world, one person dies every 40 seconds of suicide. Again, unless you bring it up, nobody talks about it.
Well, and that's certainly why I wanted to have you on. I mean, I think it hits what I'm trying to achieve square in the face, which is just opening up that conversation for families, for friends, for a man that may be listening, going, "Yeah, man, I do want to get better. I want to get some help." I mean, how can you? What would you say to inspire somebody that might be listening to the podcast that is going down a dark a dark trail? I mean,
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's no shame in it. And that's when people see me on stage, it changes their perception of what mental illness looks like and sounds like. They got one image in their head of the guy on the corner with a sign that says, "Will work for food." Then they see me, wrote for Leno for 20 years, 35 years stand-up comic, 6 TEDx talks, and I'm funny. And all of a sudden that changes their perception, which can change prejudices, which makes it easier for people in the audience to come forward and say, "I have a similar problem." That happens almost every time I speak somewhere. Is that after I leave and I talk to the meeting planner later, you're not going to believe people came out of the woodwork, Frank. We had no idea they were living with this.
what does it feel like when you hear that, by the way?
Oh God, I weep. I was doing this thing in New York. I think I told you seven keynotes in 2.5 days.
Yeah.
I give out my phone number every time. And I said, look, if you're suicidal, call the hotline. If you're just having a bad day, call a crazy person. Here's my cell. And it was mostly men, construction workers. And the next morning, I woke up to a text that said, "Can I have that number again for help?" Didn't want to reach out then during Q&A. Didn't want to come up afterwards privately,
Wow.
but wanted help. I mean, I cried when I saw it, and then I recounted it for the next several keynotes, and cried when I said, "This is why we start the conversation right here. We may have saved a life yesterday." So that it's very therapeutic for me to hear people say that or get a text or get a a Facebook message or something, a note on my YouTube. Somebody writes me, replies to a YouTube video, and it
Yeah.
happens. Not all the time, but it does happen.
Well, speaking of that, as we begin to wrap up, and I'm going to put, all your information in the show notes. How can people get a hold of you? And if they're looking for help, how would you suggest they go about doing that?
You go to the mental health comedian, or as we say down south, the mental health comedian. If you put an email address in, there's our first book. I narrated it for Audible, and I kept an MP3 copy. You can download the entire 4.5 hours unabridged of the first book, me narrating it. If you're having difficulty, I would, if you work somewhere, they've got an EAP, Employment Assistance Program. They've got mental health benefits. You go see HR. And then if you want something offsite, just go to Google, type in the name of your county and free mental health services. And what you're going to get is a list of, some are free, some are on a sliding scale, some you have to have Cadillac insurance and a low deductible and copayment, but you're going to get a list of resources.
Right.
I would advise a mental health checkup with a professional evaluation. See what it is. Is it depression? Is it bipolar? And I would get a physical, a full-on physical, because sometimes physical ailments present as mental health symptoms. There was a woman whose son, she was at the last conference I was at, somehow had gotten heavy metals, small amounts in his brain.
Oh my God.
And it was causing, he had psychotic breaks. And they did, I don't know, it was chelation or whatever. They were able to remove most of the heavy metal traces or whatever from his brain. And, you wouldn't know today that he'd been down that road. So I would say a mental health checkup, a physical checkup. And if your medication is not working, only a third of the people like the psych med they're on. Means 2/3 it's not working for them. There's now a DNA cheek swab test, like Ancestry. You do a cheek swab, you send it into the company. If you look up DNA, cheek swab, depression drugs, you'll find it. There's like half a dozen companies. And they try to match the drug to your DNA, match your DNA to the drug that works best with your personal metabolism. So there's a lot less of that experimentation. Go on, you hate it, taper off, go on, you hate it, taper off. That's what I would do.
Oh, I think that's great advice. I'll put all your contact information in the show notes. And I'd just like to say, before we wrap up here, that today's show was brought to you by Gatorade at the Kansas City airport. And I only say that because it's been over your shoulder the entire podcast. So Gatorade, reach out to me. Be happy to bring
product placement. It's all about product placement.
Yeah, as it turns out. And Gatorade could be the first True Man sponsor, which I think worked out super well. So, Frank, just I wanted to thank you for being on the show and bringing some awareness to this. We really enjoyed having you and sharing a few laughs with you, even though this is a rather serious topic.
Yeah, but with the laughs, it's a lot easier to digest. And again, people are watching going, this guy has depression and thoughts of suicide? Really? They have no idea this is what depression is. People are telling me, I don't know anybody with mental illness. Oh, yes, you do. 1 in 4 people in the U.S. has a mental challenge. So you definitely know somebody who's got one. You just don't know because we keep to ourselves.
Yeah. Well, let's bring awareness to it and get it out there. That was the whole point of having you on today. So thanks a lot, Frank. Have a safe flight.
I'm going to go get some Gatorade.
Yeah, go get some Gatorade. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mike.